All right. Well, good morning. We're glad to have you here with us this morning. Eric, if you wouldn't mind keeping an eye on the people coming in. Um, I mentioned earlier, as we're letting you in, you're going to come in muted. And so if you need something to say, just make sure that you do unmute yourself. We figured that was a better way to start than with everyone talking. If I hope that you were able to worship with us this morning through our live stream. It was a really, I think, really important sermon that we heard and time that we had together. This is our last Sunday, at least for the time being, where we will be just only live streaming our worship together. Next Sunday, we're going to be worshiping in person for those who are able, outside and under the oak grove. We will still be live streaming it. So if you aren't able to be here with us in person for whatever reason, you, of course, will still be welcome to participate with us in worship. But we hope to see you here in person as well. We are going to go ahead and jump in. A couple of things about our class. I did send out last night a link, of course, to the readings for this morning. I also included a resource that I hope we can begin to kind of build up together, a Google Doc that has where we can compile resources, both readings. I kind of split them up into going deeper and getting practical. And so some things that we can, resources we can share, books and articles and whatnot, that will give us more information that might be helpful as we're doing our own research. And then ideas that we can share with one another about how we can really embody these things that we're talking about. That's all I have for this morning. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Josh, and we'll get started. Thanks for being here. Barry, I'll go ahead and speak to that real quick.
Well, thank you, Brad, and welcome.
I'm sorry. Barry asked a question in the chat, which is a great question. For next Sunday, we're going to discuss it tonight at 5:30 this evening. We're going to have one of our monthly meeting on Zoom. The link is in all of the places. And we will discuss something about it. We really want a little bit more feedback from everyone. The plan will be for that at this point to be on Zoom, time to be determined. But we will worship together in person and then go home for this meeting. And so the time will likely change. Next week it will not be at 10:15. We're not sure exactly yet what time that will be, but we'll discuss that tonight and certainly let you all know this week where we land. That's a great question, Barry. Sorry, Josh, go ahead.
No, that's fine. I'm grateful that we were able to anticipate that question, and look forward to seeing how this works as we do in person and virtual. So welcome again, and very glad to have you with us. I know a few people are just now popping in, but I will go ahead and pull up a little bit of a PowerPoint we'll be using. So just want to make sure everyone can see that. If you can give me a thumbs up that you see it on your screen. Okay. Well, I'm grateful to be with you, and we have, as always, all of you are special participants, but we have a special guest today who will be sharing in conversation with me, Elizabeth Brown, and as well as Carl Franklin. So I'm going to introduce them at the different times in our conversation. But just as a reminder, especially if you are coming into this new, we are taking this journey through thinking about our participation in creation as Christ's body and how we encounter Christ in creation during the ecumenical season of creation, when churches across the world are celebrating creation, praying and lamenting over our abuse of it, and asking that we be agents in cooperation with the Holy Spirit in its healing. So there's yet another reminder that there are resources for prayer and for devotion, for celebration during this season. We had last been talking about especially the resources of Scripture and seeing Christ in creation. And now we're coming into a moment where we'll be thinking even more concentratedly about how our worship and our celebration and also our lament as the body of Christ um, draws us into participation in creation. So today we're thinking especially about communion, and by that I mean the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, and how that central meal of the church involves us in relating to Christ and creation and what the implications of it are. And next we'll be thinking about a concept that will emerge a little bit in our discussion today, and that has already been anticipated in some of our previous conversations, and that is, how might we understand our role collectively as priests in creation? What does that, especially in a Baptist context where we are used to celebrating the priesthood of all believers, what might that mean for our role in creation as Christ's body and creation care? So our conversations have inspired some fascinating emails that have come to Brett and to me, and and I've had a number of others too. And be warned that when you send a beautiful, convicting email, you just might be, as Carl is now, called to share what you were moved to share in that email. So I didn't want this word from Carl to be kept back from you, Carl Franklin. I'll ask you, Carl, if you would mind sharing with us what you had emailed me earlier this week.
Okay, thank you, Josh. I have to admit that listening to you and to Bob really got me thinking and excited, and I thought back to the many years we spent in Papua New Guinea. And if you've met my wife and I and talked to us very long, you probably heard the words Papua New Guinea. And it's a country that we came to love. We were there when it became independent 45 years ago. And just by way of background, it's one of the largest islands in the world, as you probably know. It's north of Australia. There are 840 distinct languages spoken in Papua New Guinea. And if you go over on the Indonesian side and include that, there are 1,000 languages on that island, which is a good part of the 7,000 languages that are spoken in the world. Our task was to translate the New Testament, the Bible, but to do so, we had to learn the language of the people. And living in the country, I learned to speak 3 of the languages and worked on a number of others. But these are marginal languages. What Eric called this morning, these are bottom rung people. When you think of these languages, 37% of them have less than 1,000 speakers. These are small marginal groups scattered throughout the country in river valleys and tributaries and so on. And living with a group of these people, I soon realized that they knew a great deal about nature more than I did. And I thought of this, and we were trying to, excuse me, learn the language, but I soon saw that they had 160 different types of trees, 40 different names for sweet potato varieties, 21 varieties of sugarcane, 15 varieties of bananas, and so on and so on. And I could learn the generic names, but that was about all. And here I was among unschooled and pre-literate people who had intuitively learned all of these things, that God had creatively given them the ability to weave patterns, knit items, build houses, do all kinds of things from their own knowledge of culture. And this was a wonderful example of creativity to me. It's unfortunate that these small groups are soon to be marginalized. They're being exploited by companies who want their natural resources, their oil, their gas, their gold, their copper, their minerals, their timber, their fish, you name it. It's there and people are after it. But these people that we worked with, they depended on the land and the forest for food, and they lived in creation, and they knew certain things. They knew you just couldn't complete. You had to let the ground lie fallow once in a while. You had to have gardens that needed nutrients, and you put them there, and you couldn't hunt game till it'd be completely exhausted. They had this God of creation to put these conservative ideas in their hearts, we would say in English, and Kewa, you would say in their livers or in their stomachs. That would be the idiom. And given them a knowledge of flora and fauna that far exceeded our own. And that creativity inspired us to do a book and to record what we could have. I think we did 735 different items that were on flora and fauna. And this became a reading book for the people whom we taught to read and write in their own language. Remember, these were unschooled, illiterate, did not have a written language to begin with. One other thing I'll mention to show creativity that is really unique in many parts of Papua New Guinea is counting. To count in Kewa, you began with your little finger of your left hand, and you called the name of that little finger, which was Ekaita. And then the next one, Ekaita Yame, Anda Ki Mala Shu Shumini, and so on. Keripo, and you enumerated 47 parts of the body. And these were links to things items that you wanted to remember. So you might say, well, at the elbow joint, we're going to have a festival. And that meant 9 moons or 9 months, what you reckon that way. So here was a creative idea of counting. And then there was a 4-base system that they had. 1, 2, 3, 4, add a thumb. 6 was 1, 2, 3, 4, add 2 thumbs, 3 thumbs for 7, and then 8 was 2 sets of 4 fingers. And you could count like that with a 4-base system. Creative, tremendous. And then, of course, money came in and a decimal system. So the decimal system counted men. So 2 sets of hands was 10, 2 sets of hands and 2 sets of feet were 20, and 1 man was 20, and so forth. You could count that way using decimals. Creativity always being expressed in the language in a way that God had given them. So that, you inspired me and Bob with his comments about flora and fauna to go back and think about what I'd learned from the Kewa and to realize that these so-called marginal groups have a lot to offer. And our prayer is that they won't be completely become extinct like many Native American languages, Australian Aboriginal languages, and other languages that the world have. So thank you for the opportunity to express this, Josh. I really appreciate what we're learning and how, Christ as a name may not have been in creation. They had never heard about Christ, but they had a God, a supreme being, and they knew about him, and they knew that lightning and thunder and other natural elements came through his power. So that was there, and I'm thankful that we were able to experience it and learn from those people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. I had just got a notice that my internet connection is unstable. So if you see me jittering, let me know and I'll speak slower. But Carl, what you were saying is, I think, so deeply important that we tend to think of the discussion of creation as a matter of conservation when it comes to, quote, natural resources, and ignore that part of creation is culture, and part of God's immense diversity in the way that he is expressed and revealed himself is in the manifold shapes in which human life takes place. And how many cultures around the world that we regard, as you have said, as, or can be regarded and treated as marginal, or, quote, in this horrible term, primitive, actually have tremendous forms of wisdom from which we can learn. And I would point people to a recent exhortation by Pope Francis And we can put this on the Google link resource that Brett has shared with us. But just so you have some context for this, he is talking about in the Amazon region, people groups who are very much in the same condition as those that Carl was mentioning in Papua New Guinea. Thousands of different communities scattered across the Amazon, hundreds of different languages, each of them developed in unique and sensitive dialogue with the different ecosystems in which they exist, with hundreds of names for different creatures and plants, an astonishing store of wisdom and knowledge and ways of relating and expressing God's creation. And the same forces are at work to clear the land, clear the forest, and the people from it. Mining, ranching, forestry or timber. And so the Pope wrote this in response to a gathering of bishops concerned about what is happening to these peoples in this region. And one of the statements that came out of it in response to this gathering was, "We are a region of stolen territories." And the Pope in Querida Amazonia, this exhortation in response to this gathering of bishops, which means beloved Amazon, says, we need to remember that we have potentialities in nature that could be lost forever, but also something similar could happen, and he really goes on to say is happening at a very alarming rate with cultures that have a message yet to be heard, but are now more than ever under threat. And so his conclusion from this is that the church needs to become incarnate in a distinctive way in each part of the world, to learn from each place that it comes, so that the bride of Christ can take on a variety of faces that better manifest the riches of God's grace. So what Carl was saying about the wisdom and creativity of God expressed through countless cultures, the Pope is asking us to affirm and to see this is the way that God continues to expand, to deepen, to diversify the body of Christ, that we need these other witnesses to give full witness to the grace and the wisdom of God as it's displayed in creation. And tying into our discussion today, this is for the Pope rooted in his understanding of Eucharist, his understanding of communion, or what sometimes in our circles we might call the Lord's Supper. And he puts it this way. I'll just pull out a few things from here. For him, it's the Eucharist that should inspire the church to receive the new faces it might take with Amazonian features from all these different people groups. Because he believes in the Eucharist, God, in the culmination of the mystery of the incarnation, chose to reach our intimate depths through a fragment of matter, in becoming man, but then also in continually making himself available through the creatures of bread and wine. And so the Eucharist is a moment where for the Pope we encounter something that is deeply true about God's relationship to creation in Christ. It's where God joins heaven and earth, joins himself to his creation. And in this sense, encountering God does not mean fleeing from the world or turning our back on nature. If in this particular sacrament of the Eucharist, in the bread and the wine, in the Pope's perspective, God makes himself present and encountered, then that's a sign of what creation on the whole is intended for, communion with God. And it means, therefore, that we have to be willing to take up all the resources of creation, including all the diverse expressions of culture and indigenous peoples, into the worship of God. So I want to ask us to really think more about what this central meal of the church could demand in our relationship to creation. But I want to do that acknowledging that in this context, we're coming to it probably very differently than the Pope might. And just to say it out loud, why are we talking about the Eucharist at a Dayspring Baptist Church? I know that many of us in this congregation have grown in deeper appreciation of a sacramental theology, but I think it bears saying that many Baptists, and we still, use grape juice instead of wine, right? Um, instead of Eucharist, we might say communion or Lord's Supper. Instead of the sacrament, at least many Baptist churches would still say ordinance. And that points to a different understanding that Baptists have tended historically to receive this central meal of the church as a symbol obediently kept in memory of Jesus. So it's an ordinance, a command that God gives us in Christ to keep, and we keep it in memory of his sacrifice for us. But less emphasis has been placed on encountering Jesus there. So I do want to just admit that as a difference in the background, probably for many of us coming into this conversation, whether or not we consider ourselves Baptist, whether or not we hold that view of Baptist theology. But I think it has to be admitted. And so I think a big question that comes from this I want us to consider is, what can a discussion of the Eucharist say to people meeting at or Zooming with a Baptist church about our relationship with Christ and creation? And I don't have a preset answer to that. That's something I want us to think about together through this conversation. We're going to be doing it through a resource and a reading that you've had. And I'm just going to highlight a few things from this, and then Elizabeth and I will be in conversation, and we're going to invite you to join the conversation. So the reading that you have today is from George Theokritoff, and he recently passed away. He was a theologian and also a geologist, primarily a geologist, who became more and more of a theologian over time. And it's from a collection of writings by different Orthodox, so Eastern Orthodox Christian theologians on the environment and creation. And you had a little bit of a nod to this, an introduction to it from Bill McKibben, whom some of you might know as the co-founder of 350.org, which is arguably the most important climate action group now existing. And it really was inspired by his own Christian conviction as well, at least for him. He is a practicing Methodist. And one thing that McKibben says in his introduction, I think, can be helpful as a way of beginning to think about, okay, we may not have the same theological perspectives as the Pope, or perhaps even as George Theokritoff and his understanding of what takes place in the Eucharist, but what might we take? What might we still take from this discussion? And so McKibben puts it this way: the sacramental notion that the Logos, or Christ who holds creation together and has become part of it, can be seen and encountered in every created thing in the Eucharist, but then more widely in creation, is scandalously powerful. And it undercuts the alien idea of the Western tradition of God and man in his image apart from the natural world. And so for McKibben, this becomes one more motive for caring deeply about the creation, especially in this climate change threatened world. It's no longer something to ignore or see as a background. It is the place where we encounter, have communion with God. It's something to love. So that's something he drew out of reading these essays, including this essay from Theokritoff. And just a little bit of a background for Theokritoff's reading that you've had today, and to connect this to some conversations we've had before. So last year, we'd read Alexander Schmemann in Adult Formation, and his views as a fellow Orthodox theologian deeply shape what Theokritoff writes in the piece you've read today. Norman Wiersbe, whom we discussed last time, I think does a good job quoting and summarizing Schmemann, so I'm going to steal from him, especially also because he anticipates some things that we'll be talking about next time with the priesthood of believers in creation. So he quotes Schmemann, who says that, reminds us that Eucharist means thanksgiving for a gift. Eucharistic thanksgiving involves knowing that everything in the world and the world itself is a gift of God's love, a revelation of God of his very self, summoning us in everything to know God, through everything to be in communion with God. And Wiersbe says in response to this, giving thanks restores people to their role as Eucharistic, thanksgiving beings and as priests of creation. And this Eucharistic priestly function, Wiersbe says, I have in mind the ability of people to receive the world from God, share it with others, and give it back to God as a blessing. So in that meal of receiving the bread and the wine, or the grape juice in our case, as a gift from God, and then offering it back to him in thanksgiving, Wiersbe and Schmemann are saying, we're practicing a role for which we're really meant as human beings, to receive in the Eucharistic meal, but also in all of creation, a communion with God, and to offer it back to him in thanksgiving. And that's a underlying view that's very important to what Theocritos is going to say. Wiersbe says this one other thing on Schmemann. He says, Schmemann says that when people bring themselves and the elements of bread and wine as representative of the whole of the material world to the Eucharistic table, and there offer them as gifts to God, they embrace and fulfill our humanity as Eucharistic or thanksgiving beings. We are created as celebrants of the sacrament of life, of its transformation into communion with God. Real life is Eucharist, a movement of love and adoration to God, the movement in which alone the meaning and the value of all that exists can be revealed and fulfilled. And what's really underlying this is a conviction that in that meal, we receive Christ, offer back creation to him as a gift in thanksgiving, and in that anticipate what all creation is meant for and moving towards, communion with God, reconciliation with God. It's a foretaste, taking part in that communion for which creation is meant. He says something pretty astonishing here, it might seem, that the bread and the wine represent the whole of the material world. And, you know, that might seem just sort of mystical or poetic. As an English professor, I'm used to hearing people say, oh, that's just poetic. That's just sort of an exaggeration to say that bread and wine represent the material world. Well, the reading from today by Theocritos is a challenge to take that very seriously. What would it mean to take seriously the materiality of the bread and the wine, or the grape juice, in the meal of Eucharist or communion? And so you all have, I hope, been able to do this reading. It was very short, but I'll just emphasize a few things that he says. And one thing that he says is to say, well, let's remember on a basic level, we're eating bread. What's bread? And he points us to the whole cycle of life involved in simply the wheat that goes into bread. All the cycles of soil and sun and water he points to that make wheat grow, the whole process through which it goes, and all the planting and the sowing and the harvesting involved. So right there, you have a reminder of all the other things in creation to which bread is connected. I have here a less cheery reminder of the connections of bread that I'm not going to emphasize in too much, but just want to point out. I think this is a context for some of what Theocritos is calling us to consider, and that is that in our making of bread, in our making of the elements of creation into the Eucharist or into the communion meal, there is also some damage. So this is just one report, in this case from India, of all the greenhouse gas emissions involved now because of industrial agriculture in the making of bread and the processing of wheat. So we do need to remember that context. Maybe alongside Thanksgiving, there's occasion for lament too in our receiving of this meal. So I'm just going to, you'll see as we go through, I'm going to flash up reminders of this larger cycle of creation, right, in which each of the elements of this meal are involved, but also too, the imprint world in the present world, leaving on that creation, even in the making of these things. He says, well, what's wine or grape juice? And he reminds us of the whole process by which wine comes to be, from the growing to the harvesting, to the producing of the wine. Here again is a reminder of the other things that we emit now because of the way that industrial agriculture works. What is water? Both of these depend upon water. We're getting into the whole hydrosphere, the whole operation of water and all of its cycles that we've learned about through grade school. And if you're like my daughter, you learned about it through Miss Frizzle. You'll know what I mean if you've seen the Magic School Bus. But the whole cycle of the water cycle is involved in these elements of the meal. Yet again, a reminder of how we're impacting and changing that water cycle. The soil. Well, all this requires soil. That itself is involved, Theoktoth reminds us, in the weather cycles and the cycles of microorganisms that help break down the materials of rock into minerals, and then the organic matter that's combined with that from the death of plants. And then how that is turned into humus, that top layer that's so productive for life and for growth. Also, again, through the action of trillions of microorganisms. So now we're talking about the hydrosphere, we're talking about microorganisms, we're talking about weather, we're talking about all the cycles, right, of creation being involved in the making of the bread and the wine or the grape juice. Again, I think it's appropriate to remember how that cycle of soil is being changed by us. Well, what about matter? All this is matter, isn't it? And he takes us back to the origins of matter as we know it in the cosmic dust, the explosion of stars. And he draws from this a very profound statement. Christ's words, "This is my body, this is my blood," have a profound literal sense, and that the matter making up the Eucharistic bread and wine, and that making up the flesh and blood taken from his holy mother, Christ from Mary, share the same cosmic origin. So in a very concrete, literal sense, when Christ says, "This is my body, this is my blood," that is true, right? That the matter shared in the meal of the Eucharist is also the matter that Christ has taken on in his body and shares the same source. So one conclusion, a set of conclusions that Theoktoth draws from this meditation is, on one hand, in this bread and in this cup of wine, we offer the entire cosmos and every living creature, including ourselves. So if Eucharist is, in one understanding, an offering of thanksgiving to God of the gifts of creation, that we might receive him back through them, then if we really understand what bread and wine or grape juice, soil and water are, they really are, in a very concrete sense, these two elements representing every living creature, including ourselves. Everything from the tiniest particles of matter to the farthest reaches of space, as well as all the fruits of human labor that are involved in making them. So what he says from this is that the Eucharist points us to creation as a sacrament, a means of communion, a gift from God for us to till and keep, but certainly not a commodity to be abused. If all of its cycles are in the Eucharist encountered, right, as a moment of communion and gift from God, of his presence, then certainly that view should inform the way we treat the rest of creation. And it helps us to perceive more clearly Christ, the word and wisdom of God, who comes to us in bread and wine, present in every element of creation and at work in all its processes. There's a lot we can take from this. What I'd like to do is to invite Elizabeth, if you would be happy to join me. And I'm interested to see what questions came up for you as you read. We can talk through those, and then we'll come also to our breakout sessions.
Yeah. Well, this reading really captured my imagination. I really love how big it goes and how small it goes. Okay, so back about 10 years ago, I heard this interview with a scientist whose discipline I can't remember, but he was talking about science being like a source of wonder in his faith. And I was just really captivated by this one quote, something that he said that I just come back to over and over again, which I'm not going to get exactly right, but it was basically this understanding for him that we are this point of consciousness in the tension between this infinite bigness and this infinite smallness. And something about us, we know it. Everything is in that middle, but we know it. And that's just a really profound position for us to have in creation. And we are part of it, but we know what it is we're a part of. And that, like, the further out you look, the bigger it gets. And the further in you look, the smaller it gets. And they haven't found an end in either direction. And so that just, I don't know, that's what this reminded me of was, what does it mean, you know, to be that point of conscious witness to the infinite bigness and the infinite smallness? Like, what does it mean to be that witness to that? And I think that the Eucharist specifically is a moment to hold that. And so I know growing up evangelical, we definitely took the, you know, symbolic approach, and also just the approach that, like, this is just about remembering that this is for the forgiveness of my sins so that I am in God's good grace and I can move on with my week and come back for more next time, you know. And it had nothing to do with community, connectedness to anything or anyone around me. It was very, you sat there and you prayed in your heart to make yourself right with God, and then you took the elements that made you right with God. And I'm just stunned sometimes by how much we miss, you know, by ignoring mystery. And it also gives me a lot of, like, I know I felt a lot of lament by how much we have taken away mystery from maybe indigenous peoples, and like there's something in them, they know this stuff. There's something in people, like, this is in our hearts. And this is the other thing it reminded me of was, I think it's a Hindu myth about, like, the boy, a god disguised as a boy, and his mother looks in his mouth and sees the entire universe down his throat. And I'm like, there's something in us that knows about this bigness way before we had the Hubble Space Telescope. And there's something that made my heart a little happy to be like, over here in the Orthodox Christian tradition, there's this element of it. We're not all like reductionist and have, you know, lost all the mystery. Like, we do have it in our faith, and there is a place to connect with that, and we haven't missed it completely. And we are part of that, even though we're not Orthodox. That's still part of our faith tradition. And so I'm rambling a little bit, but I guess it comes back to that question of why and how did we turn the Eucharist into an individual act? Like, why did we do that? And what was that was a turn. Like, that seems like that was a specific choice to distance maybe from Orthodox, or when, like, was that a church split thing? That's a very specific question I have. And then, I don't know, it's just neat to me that sometimes science seems to unveil something that seems super fantastical that we believe. Like, it seems like such an act of faith, and then science comes along and says, well, actually, death does sustain life. Like, this whole Jesus dying to give us life, that's actually, you know, the natural order of things, but he just did it on the biggest, you know, unreachable level in our world. So I just find that amazing that maybe these things aren't as fairy tale-ish as they seem, but we can believe them in faith, but then science comes along and kind of says, actually, you can go there. Like, it's not totally unrelated to the natural world. So those were my thoughts, and my questions about what does it mean to be this point of conscious witness in that tension would probably be my main question.
Yeah, what a beautiful set and array of meditations and responses, though. Which I feel could each of them be a whole new class. And it'd be exciting to do that. But I think your main question, I think, is really important. And I'm very tempted to do the annoying teacher move of saying, well, now what do you think? How did you answer your own question? Uh, so I actually will. But then I do think it can point us to something really profound about the reading today, even if we don't consider ourselves to have the same theological perspectives as Orthodox Christians. So, but I want to hear your response first.
Okay, well,
question.
sure. Yeah. Okay. So where I went, what it made me think about, which you've alluded to, kind of we're going that direction with the class, but it made me think about the priesthood, like that it is a sacrament and a ritual and an actual, it made me think of the priests, the high priest in the temple that did the sacrifices for all these reasons, not just because it did this thing, but because it shows us who we are in the greater story, and that we get to kind of name creation through the act of Eucharist, and we get to witness like, hey, we do know the bigness and the smallness in our limited capacity, and we can meet with God in that middle point. So it did make me think of, this is something about priesthood. I mean, the animals worship, right? Creation worships, but we hold something up through that knowing, and through that something about our conscious witness, I think is about priesthood.
Yeah, and I think that is very similar to something that Yakutov is getting at when he does refer to this idea of the priestly function, right, of the Eucharist, and how if we really understand any given piece of matter, but the bread and the wine, or the bread and the grape juice, as connected in really in the most profound sense to the tiniest particle of the universe from its origin, then in taking that and offering it back to God as thanksgiving, and recognizing this is a gift through which you meet us, however we understand that, right? You've given us, even if you just say this is something we do to remember your sacrifice for us, you've given us this concrete, tangible way of doing that, and of encountering your sacrifice for us. That is that unique point of consciousness and meeting that, as far as we know, other creatures don't offer, right? And that can, in representation, recognize the whole of creation as a gift for communion, as a way that God makes himself known to us, to which he's joined himself, in incarnation. And so the idea that the church as a whole, in offering up and then receiving back the communion meal, is performing a priestly function of worship, I think is deeply profound and very unique to that point of conscious awareness, that you've pointed out for us. Yeah, I think that's a really profound point to emphasize. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think that is a lot to chew on.
Yeah.
And so, I have lots and lots of other ideas. At one point I was like, this feels like a conversation that would be best accompanied with like black lights and questionable substances, because it was so big. But it's a beautiful and overwhelming kind of place to realize we have that awareness, and that we choose whether or not we want to be aware of it. So even that choice to enter that awareness, we don't think about it all the time. And a lot of times I think we try not to think about it all the time. And sometimes it takes seeing the bigness or the smallness to make us uncomfortable. I loved what he said. I said I wasn't going to say more, but now I'm saying more. I loved what he said about the idea that we can't know God, but we can experience God. Obviously that may have different kind of interpretations, but that like nature or creation gives us the gift of feeling small. And I don't know about you, but I feel uncomfortable. It's an unsettling thing. It's unsettling. And like for me personally, like I've been following the Hubble Space Telescope on Instagram for a while, and I'm finding that those images are beautiful but unsettling. because it's like, what is that out there? And it's really weird. And it's, and to think that that's still the known creation and that God is bigger than that and more, dare I say, unsettling than even that. It's just kind of a, I don't know, that's another tension to sit in for me.
Most definitely. And I
Hey,
think
Josh.
one other, yeah.
This is Kevin.
Oh, hey, Kevin.
Just a little clarity on this quote here on the screen. In this
Mhm.
bread and in this cup of wine, we offer the entire cosmos. I need some clarification on what are we offering? Are we offering Thanksgiving for, or is that the, because of the brackets there that you
Mhm.
applied there? Because if you could explain that, that'd be helpful for me anyway.
Sure.
I'll mute myself now.
Oh, okay. Well, what I understand him to be saying is that on one hand, we are offering it in thanksgiving and in gratitude. And where he goes, because of his sacramental understanding that this is really becoming the body and the blood of Christ, this is where God makes himself present to his people. I think he goes even a bit further to say, we offer this so that God might offer himself back to us. So that if the bread and the wine are tied to, as he's tried to argue, all the other elements of creation, on one hand, it's offering up in thanksgiving, and it's also receiving back God's offering to us of himself. And I mean, I would say that even if you don't go that far, it is certainly, I think, something that has, for me at least, I'll just say personally, growing up with more of a memorialist belief that it is purely a symbolic memory of what Christ did for us. As I've gone through Eucharist and communion in different traditions of the church and just experiencing it myself, it is impossible for me not to believe that there is a real encounter with God there that's very unique, that he is making himself available to us, Christ is. And so I can still receive that one basic emphasis from this, that in offering up these elements, we do give the, kind of offer and praise, thanksgiving for the gift of creation to God, but then also receive him uniquely through it. And that can point us to the way we understand the rest of creation, which is that it is a gift offered to us that we might know God through it and might receive him through what he has made. So that's one way I understand this statement. Does that help at all, Kevin?
I'm thinking about it. It's a lot to
Okay.
take. So,
There's a lot to take in.
Elizabeth's comment about the Hubble telescope, I follow that too. And those images and the expansiveness of the universe. I loved her word unsettling, because they are unsettling, because we become so, we as in this planet and each of us individually become so small in comparison to that. And how does God think about all us when there's all these billions of galaxies in which each of them have billions of stars? It is unsettling. So
It is. But I find not only beautiful but profound the reality that if you consider all of the universe coming from one large explosion, that I believe was creatively enabled, sustained by God, then all of that matter, all those billions and trillions of stars, are in a profound sense connected to our very bodies, and to the body that Christ himself took on, through the cosmic dust. That's the basis of matter as we know it. And so in a really profound way, any particle of creation with which I have contact is connected to the rest. And in this meal, we have this reminder, this deep affirmation that God has made himself in Christ part of that, and is meeting us in his creation. If only we say in the incarnation, in his taking on of a body, right, and going through all the processes of life that we do and enjoying that to himself forever. So it's unsettling, but it's also astonishing, to consider that. Yeah. Here's what I'd like us to do. I know there's a lot on the table here, and very really concretely as we're thinking about the table of communion, we put a lot on there to think about. What I would invite us to do is to come back to this bigger question of, we've heard at least some perspectives of how the Eucharist can be considered in terms of creation through Theocritus. And we still have some questions about that, and that's totally fine to raise. But what can this discussion say to people meeting again in a Baptist church where perhaps our sacramental theology might be different, our understanding of what's happening in the Eucharist might be different? But what can it still say to us about our relationship with Christ and creation if we've taken anything from this, that it can impact the way we approach communion or the Lord's Supper ourselves, and what it might say to us about our relationship with Christ and his creation? So I wonder if we can do our breakouts, Brett, and give people an opportunity to consider this, and then to appoint just one person, as usual, a member from your group, to share with us some of the things that come up in your conversation.
Sounds good. Yep. We're just going to take about 6 minutes or so. So I'm going to go ahead and create these again, totally randomly. Enjoy, and then I'll call you back in just a minute.
Okay.
All right, Josh, it's all yours.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your considerations. I had a wonderful time in my breakout group. I hope you all did too, just thinking about this together. So as usual, I'm interested in hearing from each group, and even if you didn't have a chance to nominate a person to speak for you, then one of you each be brave and go ahead and do it. So let's hear from each group. Let's make sure we do hear from each group what emerged in your discussions.
And of course, you will need to unmute yourself if you are trying to talk. We can't hear you.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know what, we were in group 2. I think Bruce Longenecker, right there at the end, appointed us. I didn't have a chance to decline. We didn't. But I would like Eric to jump in here, because he talked about, in terms of the Eucharist, what we have been doing at Dayspring for a long time after serving, that the wine and the bread are not just thrown in the trash, but returned to creation. And he talked about it being a very small gesture of what we do with those elements, that they're not just discarded. They're continued to be, in a sense, recycled. He didn't use that word. And if Eric wants to jump in here, you could, that'd be great. The other is that Candace just mentioned, thinking about the Palm Sunday branches, that every year we save them and then turn them into ash, and they're used the next year on Ash Wednesday. Again, the cycle of how these elements, symbols, are part of our connection to creation. I will also add, in terms of Bruce, he mentioned at the end, trying to get our heads around these cosmological understandings. And he said very well, he's thinking about it, trying to make sense of it. And it's so new to all of us, I think, that it's going to take some time to ponder this. I'll stop there, and if Eric wants to jump in, he can.
I just would add one dimension to the idea that how we practice the Eucharist may have moral formation of us for how we do the rest of our lives. And just the sort of example we were using is, if we care for the elements and that in the way that you described, can that, and if so, how does that have any influence or any shaping of how we treat the rest of our food and, you know, our community? And that's a conversation much bigger than this moment here, but it is the kind of example of how the practice of the Eucharist can be formative.
I'll speak for our group. Many of us commented on, we came from a very specific way of understanding the Lord's Supper, maybe what many of you would have experienced in a Baptist church. But this reading and this time has challenged us to go beyond that very particular view. And I'll share from what I shared from the perspective of, recently I had been helping my daughter study for a biology test. So I got reacquainted with the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, the water cycle, the phosphorus cycle. And now 2 weeks later, I'm reading this article where he's unpacking that. And I'm like, wow, this is amazing timing. And at the same time, over this past year, I've been reading a lot about and writing about embodiment, and being really challenged that from our Western practice of Christianity, we have really discarded the body and ignored it or even criticized it, and how it's important to come to God with our whole bodily experience, and how God is calling us to engage in that way. And so also taking the life, death, and new life cycle, and for us in our group, seeing that unpacking of the science and all those cycles, how God is drawing us into that larger embodiment experience. And then if we frame that and look at the Eucharist and realize as a ritual that it's a way for us to engage in an embodied way, something much larger, something mind-blowing, so way beyond us. And isn't that what God is always calling so many of us to, is to enlarge our understanding, to get us closer to embracing God beyond our small understanding, but to even a bigger understanding and a more embodied experience.
Yes. This is, I'm loving the reflections that are emerging. Just out of respect of time, I think what we should do is, I want to make sure everyone shares, and then we can try to draw some of the threads together. So can we make sure we hear for some of the other groups as well?
Well, I want to say that there were several of us in Josh's group, and he doesn't know it, but we secretly elected him to be the reporter. So we're going to let him go ahead and report on our group.
I deserve that. Well, yes, I think a number of really important reflections emerged. And one was that, as Elizabeth had said earlier in the conversation, you know, one way of understanding the Lord's Supper is in a very private and individual manner, and something that's purely between myself and God. But then to have the wider understanding that emerges with really seeing it as tied to the rest of creation was something that a number of us, particularly Tom, I think, found important. But right alongside that was this, on one hand, opportunity for thanksgiving for creation, to remember our membership in it, to remember God's gift of it toward us as becoming part of it. But then a lament. It came up a number of times in our conversation, Colleen especially had mentioned this, just to come to some grips with the devastation and the extent of the devastation to all the cycles we were talking about, and all the elements we're talking about by our activity now on a global scale. And the problem seems so immense, you know, so, and the suffering so immense. So the way in which the communion Lord's Supper meal is a new level of thanksgiving, but then also lament entering into it. Not only over individual sin, but over the damage to God's creation. So those were a couple of the really profound things. And other thing I'll say that Carl had brought up is that remember the Kiowa people, they don't make bread the same way. They're going to be using potatoes, and it made us think about how actually we can remember the very different ways that the Lord's Supper is celebrated by the church across the world, using different forms of bread, wine, grape juice. But then in each case, the same basic thing can be asserted. And in some ways, in remarkable ways, particular to different cultures, right, of the materials involved in making those elements. So that was a very interesting reminder of the different ways that we can understand the Lord's Supper being materially celebrated. So those were some of the things that emerged from our group.
One of the things that we talked about in our group was someone noted the divine and human participation that's required to bring about the elements and how that connects with the image of the gardener. And I think even with different materials being used, which you mentioned, Josh, there's still this kind of divine human participation to bring about the elements, and how that is a means of thanksgiving that allows us to receive and participate, but also offer, that there's the cyclical element to it. So that was one of the things that our group discussed.
I'll jump in here off of what Regina just said. First of all, I don't think it's an accident that Mary mistook Jesus for a gardener in the resurrection. Right? I think that there's something really beautiful there for us to reflect upon about how Christ is the gardener, right? That draws us back to the hope of the Garden of Eden. Our group reflected along similar lines there about the beauty of the cooperative kind of work that happens when we prepare the Eucharist feast. But we also talked about a really important question that I think we've been dancing around a little bit here, and it is, why do we do the Eucharist at all, right? And we've talked about Orthodox theology. We'll be reading some Catholics coming up, and we've been careful to say, well, we're not Orthodox, we're not Catholic, but this is a fundamental question we have to face is, well, what do we think? And I'll just leave us with that question where our group stood, and that is to say something like, as Baptists, we offer much as charisms to the body of Christ, which is the Church Universal, but perhaps we have a good bit more to learn about what the Eucharist is for from our Catholic and Orthodox brothers and sisters.
Lovely. That is all the groups, Josh.
Indeed. And maybe that is a good question to sit with, about how that learning can take place. Oh, sorry, Brett.
Oh, sorry. I just was saying that's all the groups there.
Okay, thank you. I think my internet cut down for a second. These are very good thoughts to, I think, come away with, to continue to listen to. As a number of you mentioned, the cosmic implications of this are pretty immense. And it does take time, I think, to let those settle and to work through. So I hope we'll continue in these conversations. And I especially do feel challenged to consider more profoundly not what have other traditions within Christianity said about the Eucharist only, but what does this mean for us in the practices as day spring? So I hope we can all continue to meditate upon that. Let me, if I may, just end with a prayer. It's a very short prayer, and this is from our Orthodox brothers and sisters. And this is from a liturgy that is celebrated on the 1st of September, the celebration of creation in the Orthodox Church. And a special version of it has been put together called the Vespers for the Environment, or the Evening Prayers for the Environment. So we're not at evening, but I do think this is an appropriate prayer still. O Word, great in mercy, stooping with goodness and compassion, shower down from heaven upon the earth the streams of your divine mercy for our salvation. Stained with foul passion, Savior, we defile the atmosphere with our dread actions, but grant us, Lord, genuine repentance. Look on us, Savior, with an eye of mercy, and turn from the earth, we beg, the destruction which comes from poisonous and senseless actions. So, brothers and sisters, I hope we can join in that prayer together. That might shape our lives this coming week. And we look forward to regathering with you, both at future opportunities in Dayspring this week and then this coming Sunday. So, so go in peace.
Thank you, friends. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
See you tonight, 5:30.
That's right.